The Sikorsky R-4B beat at 210 RPM, 30 revolutions below optimal. Lieutenant Frank Peterson felt each rotation as a shudder through the rudder pedals, through the collective stick, through his chest. April 26, 1945, Naga Hills, Burma, 63 miles behind Japanese lines. Through the R-4's bubble canopy, that fishbowl of plexiglass that gave him a god's eye view and made him a target for anyone with a rifle, Peterson could see the mountain ridge ahead, 9,000 feet. The Warner R-500 engine's 180 horsepower was barely enough to keep them airborne at 7,000. His co-pilot, Sergeant James Murphy, wasn't looking at the mountain. He was looking at the envelope in Peterson's breast pocket, both envelopes. The letters they'd written 3 hours ago in the ready tent at Lalaghat airfield, sealed, addressed to their wives. "Mail call when we get back," Peterson had joked, tucking the letter away. Murphy hadn't laughed. Below them, the jungle canopy was unbroken green. No clearings, no roads, no hope for anyone on foot. Intel said a B-25 crew, 4 men, had been down there for 6 days. A fighter pilot had spotted their mirror signals that morning. Tried to drop supplies. The canopy was too thick. The parachute canisters hung in the trees like Christmas ornaments, 30 feet above men who were starving. No C-47 could land. No L-5 spotter plane could reach them through the mountain passes in this. No parachute rescue could penetrate that canopy, but one machine could hover, could lower a jungle penetrator through the, could lift one man at a time through gaps an airplane would never fit through. If it didn't fall apart, the R-4 shuddered again. Peterson heard something in the transmission, a whine that hadn't been there 10 minutes ago. The entire helicopter vibrated like a paint mixer running rocks. They were flying a machine with fewer than 300 flight hours total across all R-4S in the China-Burma-India theater, a machine that 3 years earlier had been an experimental prototype in a Connecticut hangar. A machine that, according to the manual, couldn't fly above 8,000 feet with 2 men aboard. They were about to climb. "Check the transmission temp," Peterson said into the Murphy's eyes dropped to the gauge. "Climbing, 190. Normal was 160. Red line was 220. Copy." The mountain ridge loomed ahead, granite and pine, wreathed in cloud. The wind hit them at 7,800 feet, a fist of mountain updrafts that sent the R-4 climbing 200 feet in 5 seconds, then dropping 300 in the next gust. Peterson's right hand worked the cyclic stick constantly, tilting the rotor disc forward, back, left, right, fighting wind that wanted to flip them into the rocks. His left hand held the collective pitch control, raising and lowering it to maintain altitude, feeling the engine scream with each demand for more power. His feet danced on the rudder pedals, keeping the nose pointed forward as the torque tried to spin them like a weather vane. Flying a helicopter wasn't like flying a plane. A plane wanted to fly. A helicopter wanted to shake itself apart. "Transmission temp 210. Murphy said quietly, 10 degrees from redline. Peterson looked at the ridge. They were still 500 feet below the summit. The wind was worsening. The transmission was cooking itself. And somewhere in the jungle valley beyond that ridge, 4 Americans were waiting for a miracle. "We're committed," Peterson said. Murphy nodded. He'd known that before they took off. They both had. That's why they'd written the letters. 3 years earlier, military helicopters didn't exist. Igor Sikorsky's VS-300, the machine that proved rotary wing flight was possible, first flew in September 1939. A skeletal frame, a single seat, barely controllable. It crashed regularly. Sikorsky himself piloted it, refusing to risk anyone else's life, testing a machine that defied every instinct of aviation. Fixed-wing pilots called helicopters rotary death traps. They weren't entirely wrong. By 1942, Sikorsky had refined the design enough to interest the Army Air Forces. The R-4 military designation for what Sikorsky called the VS-316 became the first helicopter ordered into production. 130 units, maximum speed, 82 miles per hour, range 130 miles, service ceiling 8,000 feet, payload 2 passengers, maximum if you weren't planning to fly very far or very high. The R-4 was underpowered, overcomplicated, and maintenance-intensive. Every 20 hours of flight time required 60 hours of maintenance. The transmission, a maze of gears connecting the engine to the rotor shaft, was the Achilles heel. Overheat it and bearings would seize, lose the transmission, and the rotor stopped. A helicopter with a stopped rotor doesn't glide. It drops. But the R-4 could do one thing no airplane could do: hover. In Burma, that capability became salvation. The 1st Air Commando Group, a special operations unit supporting British and American troops deep behind Japanese lines, received 6 R-4s in early 1944. Most officers thought they were gimmicks, expensive curiosities. The first time an R-4 landed at the forward base in Lalaghat, a colonel walked around it 3 times, then asked, "What the hell am I supposed to do with this?" 4 weeks later, a small L-5 liaison plane crashed in the Naga Hills. The pilot and 3 wounded soldiers were trapped in terrain no rescue team could reach on foot. Not before the Japanese found them. Lieutenant Carter Peterson, a former crop duster from Nebraska who'd flown every experimental aircraft the Army would let him touch, volunteered to take the R-4. He brought back 4 men in 2 trips. The colonel stopped asking questions. By April 1945, Peterson had flown 17 rescue missions. Most were short hops, 5 miles, 10 miles, landing in clearings to extract wounded from patrols, routine by helicopter standards, which meant terrifying. But the mission briefed on April 25th was different. A B-25 Mitchell bomber, tail number 43, 27634, had been flying weather reconnaissance over the Naga Hills when engine failure forced the crew to bail out. 4 men in parachutes. 1 landed in a valley accessible by ground team. 3 landed 63 miles northeast in terrain intelligence described as vertical jungle. The Japanese controlled the region. British patrols couldn't reach them in less than a week. A P-47 fighter pilot named Captain Roy Hawkins had spotted their signal mirrors that morning during a sweep. He'd made 3 passes, confirmed 4 men, tried dropping supply canisters, all hung in the trees. Hawkins's after-action report was grim. No ground extraction possible, no parachute delivery possible, terrain unsuitable for fixed-wing landing. The B-25 crew had been on the ground 6 days. Water was running out. The Japanese were searching. Peterson was called to the operations tent at 1400 hours. The map spread across the table showed topographic lines so tight they looked like fingerprints. The crash site sat in a valley surrounded by ridges exceeding 9,000 feet. To reach it, Peterson would have to cross those ridges. The R-4's service ceiling was 8,000 feet. "Can you do it?" the operations officer asked. Peterson studied the map, calculated distances, fuel consumption, and altitude performance curves he'd memorized from the R-4 manual, the manual that said, plainly, "Do not exceed operational ceiling." "I'll need to strip weight," Peterson said. "Minimum fuel load, no radios except emergency, 1 co-pilot." "You're taking someone. If the transmission fails, I need someone who can handle a hovering auto rotation." Peterson looked up. "And I need someone who can work the rescue hoist while I hold position." Sergeant James Murphy, a former merchant marine engineer who understood machinery in his bones, stepped forward. "I'll go." The operations officer looked between them. "You understand this is voluntary, and no one will blame you if—" "We understand," Peterson said. They were dismissed. 2 hours to prepare. Mechanics stripped every non-essential pound from the R-4. Extra survival gear, armor plating behind the seats, ammunition cans, even the co-pilot's seat cushion. In the ready tent, Peterson pulled out a sheet of paper and an envelope, started writing. Murphy, watching, did the same. No one said anything. Both men sealed their letters, wrote addresses, left them on the tent table. At 16:30 hours, they walked to the R-4. The crew chief, Master Sergeant Bill Hawkins, a man who treated helicopters like wounded children, met them at the aircraft. "She's as light as I can make her," he said. "Transmission fluid is fresh. I checked every linkage twice." He paused. "She's not supposed to fly this mission, Lieutenant." "I know. Bring her back anyway." Peterson nodded, climbed into the pilot's seat. Murphy climbed into the co-pilot's position, now just a metal frame with a safety belt. The Warner engine coughed, caught, roared. The rotor blades began to turn, slowly at first, then faster. The distinctive whoop, whoop, whoop that meant a helicopter was coming to life. At 16:47 hours, Peterson pulled collective pitch. The R-4 shuddered, lightened, lifted. The ground dropped away. They climbed northeast toward mountains that shouldn't be possible to cross. At 5,000 feet, the R-4 was flying smoothly. Peterson kept the airspeed at 65 knots, below the manual's recommended cruise speed, conserving fuel. Murphy had the map open on his lap, tracking landmarks against the jungle below. They'd been airborne 22 minutes. "First ridge, in 8 miles, Murphy said through the intercom. "Elevation 8,200. Peterson nodded. The R-4 could theoretically reach 8,000 feet with 2 people aboard. Theoretically, in calm air, at sea level atmospheric pressure. Burma's heat and humidity reduced engine performance. The weight of fuel, even the lightened load, reduced climb capability. And they weren't going to 8,000 feet, they were going to 9,500. The math didn't work, not on paper. But Peterson had learned something. Crop dusting in Nebraska, flying 20 feet above wheat fields, making turns so tight the wingtip vortices kicked up dust. Paper didn't know everything. Machines had moods. The R-4 had carried him through 17 rescues because he'd learned how it breathed, how it moved, where it wanted to go, and where it would fight you. Today he was asking it to do something it had never done. At 6,000 feet, the engine note changed, a slight roughness. Peterson's eyes flicked to the manifold pressure gauge, dropping. Thinner air meant less oxygen for combustion, meant less power. He'd expected this, couldn't stop it. The helicopter's climb rate decreased from 300 feet per minute to 200. Then 150. The ridge loomed ahead. Dark green jungle gave way to granite outcrops. Pine trees clung to slopes at impossible angles. The summit was still 2,000 feet above them. Transmission temp 170, Murphy reported. Still in the green, but climbing. Peterson adjusted the collective pitch, demanding more power. The engine's roar deepened. The rotor RPM held steady at 225. 15 below the optimal 240, but enough to maintain lift. The climb rate dropped to 100 feet per minute. They weren't going to make it. Unless... Hold on, Peterson said. He banked the R-4 30 degrees left toward a saddle between two peaks, a low point in the ridgeline, maybe 200 feet lower than the main summit. The wind would be worse there. Terrain funneled gusts that could flip a light aircraft, but it was 200 feet less altitude to gain. 200 feet might be the difference between making it and falling short. The saddle approached 7,000 feet, 7,500, 8,000. Peterson felt the control stick vibrating in his hand. Not mechanical failure, air turbulence. The mountain was creating its own weather, updrafts colliding with downdraft and wind shearing in 3 directions at once. The R-4 dropped 50 feet in 2 seconds. Peterson pulled collective pitch hard. The engine screamed, the climb resumed, then another gust hit from the side, a horizontal punch that yawed the helicopter 30 degrees right. Peterson's feet slammed left rudder pedal, correcting, overcorrecting, finding center. Transmission temp 190, Murphy said. His voice was steady, flat, the tone of a man who'd decided fear was irrelevant. Peterson's altimeter read 8,200. The saddle's lowest point was 8,400, 200 feet. The R-4 was climbing at 50 feet per minute. 4 minutes to clear the ridge. If the transmission held, if the wind didn't flip them, if the engine didn't quit. Come on, Peterson whispered, not to Murphy, to the helicopter. Come on, girl. The Warner engine howled. The transmission whined. A dentist drill in steel. The rotor blades beat the thin air, each revolution generating just enough lift to pull them higher. 50 feet, 100, 150. They cleared the saddle with 60 feet of vertical clearance. For 5 seconds, Peterson allowed himself to breathe. Then the downdraft hit. On the lee side of the mountain, the wind had nowhere to go but down. The R-4 dropped like an express elevator, 200 feet in 3 seconds. Peterson's stomach lifted into his throat. Murphy's hands gripped the doorframe, knuckles white. The rotor blades were still spinning, still generating lift, but the descending air mass was falling faster than the helicopter could resist. Peterson pushed the cyclic stick forward, diving away from the mountain, trading altitude for airspeed, trying to fly out from under the downdraft. The R-4 accelerated to 85 knots. Over redline speed, the airframe shaking violently, the altimeter unwound. 7,800, 76, 74. Then the downdraft released them. The R-4 bottomed out at 7,200 feet. The engine was screaming. The transmission temperature gauge read 210. Peterson eased the cyclic back, letting the airspeed bleed off, pulling collective pitch to arrest the descent and begin climbing again. Jesus Christ, Murphy said quietly. Peterson didn't answer. His eyes were on the valley ahead. Somewhere down there, in that ocean of green, 4 men were waiting. Next checkpoint is the river bend, Murphy said, forcing his voice back to professional calm. Should be visible in 3 minutes. Peterson nodded, leveled off at 7,000 feet. Let the transmission temperature stabilize. The engine note smoothed out. The vibration decreased to the normal paint mixer intensity. Outside the bubble canopy, the jungle stretched to every horizon, unbroken, impenetrable, indifferent. 2 minutes later, Murphy pointed. River, 12 o'clock. Peterson saw it, a thin silver line cutting through the canopy. He banked toward it, following the watercourse upstream. According to the map, the B-25 cruise signal had come from a ridge 2 miles north of the river's Oxbow Bend. 5 minutes to target area, Murphy said. Peterson checked his fuel gauge. 40% remaining, enough to hover for maybe 10 minutes, then fly back across the ridge if they didn't encounter headwinds, if the transmission didn't fail, if nothing went wrong. Big if. Start looking for the signal, Peterson said. Both men scanned the canopy. The B-25 crew had a signal mirror, standard survival gear. In direct sunlight, a mirror flash could be seen for miles. But the sun was lowering. Shadows were filling the valley, and the canopy was 100 feet tall in places, creating a maze of light and darkness. There, Murphy said suddenly. 10 o'clock, flat. Peterson saw it. A brief glint, then another, deliberate. 3 flashes, pause, 3 flashes. SOS. Got them, Peterson said. He banked toward the signal, descending to 500 feet above the canopy. The flashes continued. Someone down there waving a mirror, desperate, not believing what they were seeing. A helicopter. Here, now. Peterson circled the position. The canopy below showed no gaps, no clearings, just interlocking branches forming a roof over whatever was beneath. He could see movement now, figures on the ground visible through small breaks in the foliage. 4 men, waving. How do we get them out? Murphy asked. Peterson was already formulating the answer. The R-4 carried a rescue hoist, a motorized winch with a steel cable, and a jungle penetrator on the end. The steel seat, shaped like a torpedo, that could be lowered through gaps in a canopy. 1 man could ride it up at a time. The problem was hovering. To lower the penetrator, Peterson would need to hold the R-4 in a perfect hover for 90 seconds per man. 4 men, 6 minutes minimum of hovering, in wind, over terrain, with a transmission already running hot. Helicopters in 1945 couldn't hover indefinitely. The rotor wash, downward air blast from the blades, recirculated under the helicopter, reducing lift efficiency. The engine had to work harder, the transmission heated faster. Most R-4 pilots avoided hovering for more than 30 seconds at a time. Peterson was about to hover for 6 minutes. Murphy, you're on the hoist. I'll hold position. When I say lower, you lower. When I say stop, you stop. Clear? Clear. First man up, we assess weight and fuel. If we can't take all 4, we take 3 and I come back. You don't have fuel for a second trip. Then we take all 4. Murphy looked at it, nodded. Peterson maneuvered the R-4 into position over the densest part of the canopy, where he'd seen the signal mirror. The men below were visible through gaps, looking up, shielding their eyes from rotor wash. One was waving both arms. Peterson steadied the cyclic stick, reduced airspeed to 0. The R-4 transitioned from forward flight to hover, a moment when the helicopter's instability was most pronounced. He felt the machine wobble, hunting for equilibrium. His right hand made constant tiny corrections. His left hand held the collective pitch steady. His feet worked the rudder pedals, keeping the nose pointed into the wind. Hovering, Peterson announced. Lowering penetrator, Murphy said. The winch motor whined. The steel cable began to unspool. Peterson watched the jungle penetrator drop through the rotor wash, swinging, slightly descending toward the canopy. It disappeared into the foliage. 30 feet, Murphy called. 40, 50. Peterson felt the helicopter drifting left. He corrected with cyclic input. The wind was gusting from the southeast, unpredictable. Each gust required immediate response. His hand moved in millimeter increments, tilting the rotor disc, fighting the drift. 70 feet, cables snagged. Peterson's jaw tightened. Work it free. Try. A pause. Got it. Continuing down 80 feet. The transmission whine was getting louder. Peterson's eyes flicked to the temperature gauge. 215. 5 degrees from redline. 90 feet. Cable stopped moving. Someone's grabbing it. Below, invisible through the canopy, one of the B-25 crewmen was pulling the jungle penetrator toward him, mounting it, signaling ready. He's on, Murphy said. Raising. The winch motor reversed. The cable began spooling back in. Peterson felt the weight change immediately. The helicopter sagged slightly as the hoist pulled against the airframe. He added collective pitch. The engine roared. The transmission temperature hit 220. Red line. How long? Peterson asked. 30-second unages. Peterson held the hover. The cyclic stick was alive in his hand, fighting him. The wind was worsening. Gusts from different directions. The helicopter yawed 15 degrees, he corrected. It drifted backward. He corrected. The engine screamed. 20 seconds, I see him. He's clearing the canopy. Bring him in fast. 10 seconds. The jungle penetrator broke through the foliage, a man clinging to it, eyes wide, flight suit torn, face sunburned. Murphy grabbed him, hauled him into the helicopter's open cabin, unclipped him. Got him. Peterson didn't wait. He pushed the cyclic stick forward, transitioning out of the hover into forward flight. The R-4 accelerated. The transmission temperature began to drop. 215, 210. The rescued man was collapsed on the cabin floor, breathing hard. Murphy was already preparing to lower the penetrator again. "You okay?" Murphy shouted over the rotor noise. The man nodded. "3 more down there." "We know." Peterson circled back, setting up for the second hover. His fuel gauge read 30%. The transmission temperature had stabilized at 200. He had maybe 4 minutes of hovering left before the transmission seized or the fuel ran dry. 3 men to lift, 90 seconds each, 4.5 minutes. They were going to cut this very, very close. "Second position," Peterson announced, hovering. The winch whined again. The second man came up without incident. The third man, the B-25's co-pilot, with a badly sprained ankle, took 2 minutes because he couldn't grip the penetrator properly. Murphy had to pull him up the last 10 feet, manually, hand over hand, muscles screaming. 3 men in the cabin now. The R-4 was loaded beyond its rated capacity. Peterson could feel the helicopter's sluggishness in the controls. Every input took longer to register. The rotor was working harder to generate lift. And 1 man was still on the ground. Peterson circled into position for the 4th hover. His fuel gauge read 18%. The transmission temperature was hovering at 210, just below red line, but not by much. The sun was lower. Shadows were deepening, and Peterson's arms were shaking from the constant control inputs required to hold the helicopter in hovering flight. "Last one," Murphy said. "Let's get him." Peterson steadied the R-4 over the canopy, transitioned to hover. The helicopter felt wrong, heavy, reluctant, like it was fighting him. "Lowering," Murphy announced. The penetrator descended, 70 feet, 80, 90, and then Peterson heard it. A crack. Sharp. Metallic. From somewhere in the transmission housing. "Stop the hoist," Peterson said. "He's almost—" "Stop it now!" Murphy hit the winch stop. The cable froze. Below, the 4th B-25 crewman was 10 feet from the penetrator, wading through jungle undergrowth, reaching up. "What's wrong?" Murphy asked. Peterson was listening. The transmission whine had changed pitch, higher, strained. Something inside the gearbox had fractured, not failed completely, not yet, but damaged. The temperature gauge was climbing. 215, 218. "We've got a transmission problem," Peterson said quietly. "How bad?" "Bad enough." Peterson looked at Murphy. "If we load the 4th man, we might not make it back across the ridge." The words hung in the cabin. The 3 rescued men sitting on the floor looked up. They understood what Peterson was saying. 4 men extracted, 4 men flying home, 1 man still on the ground. Math. Terrible math. "We can't leave him," Murphy said. "If the transmission seizes on the way back, 5 of us go down instead of 4. "Lieutenant, I know." Peterson's voice was hard, then softer. "I know." The fuel gauge read 16%. The transmission temperature read 221, 1 degree over red line. Through the canopy below, Peterson could see the 4th man, standing beneath them, looking up, alone, knowing what the hesitation meant. Peterson thought about the letter in his breast pocket, the envelope addressed to his wife, the words he'd written. "If you're reading this, I made a choice. I hope it was the right one." He made a choice. "Murphy, get him on that penetrator." "We're overweight." "I said get him on." Murphy grinned. "Yes, sir." The winch motor restarted. The cable lowered. The 4th man grabbed the jungle penetrator, mounted it, gave a thumbs up. Murphy began reeling him in. The transmission temperature hit 223. The crack, crack, crack sound from the gearbox was constant now. Something inside was breaking apart piece by piece. Peterson could feel it in the vibration. A new frequency. A grinding undertone. 20 seconds, Murphy said. The helicopter wanted to yaw. Peterson fought it with rudder input. The fuel gauge read 14%. They needed 12% to reach the ridge, 8% to clear it. Margin for error, 0. 10 seconds. The transmission temperature gauge needle was buried against the stop. Beyond 225, into territory where the manual just said, engine shutdown required. Shutting down the engine meant falling. They were 500 feet above the jungle canopy. In a helicopter, you didn't glide. You auto-rotated. A controlled crash using the windmilling rotor to slow descent. It worked great if you were over a clearing. They weren't over a clearing. Got him. Murphy hauled the 4th man into the cabin. 4 rescued B-25 crewmen, 2 helicopter crew, 6 men total in a machine rated for 3. Peterson didn't hesitate. He pushed the cyclic stick forward, dove out of the hover, accelerated to 60 knots, shallower than he wanted, but the helicopter was so heavy it could barely gain airspeed. The transmission was howling, the engine was screaming, every gauge was in the red. "Hang on," Peterson said. He turned southwest, toward the ridge, toward home. The R-4 climbed at 50 feet per minute. Loaded with 6 men, the rotor blades were generating just barely enough lift to overcome gravity. Peterson kept the airspeed at 55 knots, slow enough to maximize climb rate, fast enough to maintain translational lift. The fuel gauge read 12%. The ridge was 6 miles away. 8,400 feet elevation at the saddle. They were at 6,000. 2,400 feet to climb at 50 feet per minute. 48 minutes of climbing. They had fuel for maybe 30 minutes. "We're not going to make it," Murphy said quietly. Peterson didn't answer. He was watching the transmission temperature gauge. It had stopped climbing, pinned at the maximum reading, which meant it was beyond maximum. Smoke was beginning to seep from the gearbox housing. Thin gray wisps, smelling like burning metal and scorched oil. The transmission was eating itself alive. If it seized, the rotor would stop. If the rotor stopped, they would fall. 6 men, no parachutes, 500 feet above the jungle canopy. Peterson's mind raced through options. He could descend, reduce power demand on the transmission, try to nurse it along, but descending meant losing altitude. They'd need to clear the ridge. He could increase airspeed, generate lift more efficiently, but that meant burning more fuel. There was no good option. So Peterson chose the least bad one. "Everybody out," he said. The cabin went silent. "Sir," Murphy said. "Everyone except Murphy, out now." The 4 B-25 crewmen stared at it. "You're 60 miles behind enemy lines," one of them said. "You're leaving us in the jungle?" "No," Peterson said. "I'm landing. You're getting out. I'm flying Murphy and the helicopter back. Then I'm coming back for you with a working helicopter. You don't have fuel to come back. Then I'll get more fuel. The Japanese are 6 miles south of here, according to intelligence. You move north. I'll be back before they find you." Peterson banked toward a clearing he'd spotted during the climb, a small break in the canopy, maybe 40 feet across. Big enough to land, barely. "This is insane," the B-25 pilot said. "Yes," Peterson agreed. "Murphy, get ready to unload." Peterson descended toward the clearing. The R-4 was vibrating so hard his vision was blurring. The transmission smoke was thicker. The fuel gauge read 10%. He transitioned to hover, every instinct screaming that the transmission would seize right now, and lowered collective pitch. The helicopter settled into the clearing. Skids touched earth. Peterson kept the rotor turning. "Out," he ordered. The 4 B-25 crewmen climbed out, reluctant, disbelieving. They stood at the clearing's edge, watching. Peterson pulled the collective pitch. The R-4 lifted. Now it was just him and Murphy. The helicopter felt light again, responsive. The climb rate increased to 150 feet per minute. "Fuel at 8%, Murphy reported. "Copy." The ridge loomed ahead. They were at 7,000 feet. The saddle was at 8,400, 1,400 feet to climb, at 150 per minute. 9 minutes of climbing. The fuel gauge read 7%. They weren't going to make it. Peterson pushed the airspeed to 65 knots, sacrificing climb rate for forward speed, gambling that momentum would carry them over the ridge even if the engine quit. The transmission smoke was now a steady stream. The whine was a shriek. 7,500 feet. The saddle was a mile ahead, 1,000 feet below them. Fuel 5%. 8,000 feet. The saddle was half a mile ahead, 400 feet below them. Fuel 3%. The engine coughed. Fuel starvation. The Warner R-500 was sucking vapor from the bottom of the tank. It coughed again, stumbled. The rotor RPM began to drop. 225, 220, 215. Peterson lowered collective pitch, reducing power demand. The rotor RPM stabilized at 210, below minimum, but enough to maintain lift. For now, 200 feet below the saddle. The ridge was right there, so close. The engine quit. Silence. Not true silence. The rotor was still windmilling, auto-rotating as air rushing up through the blades kept them spinning. But the powered roar was gone, replaced by the whisper of wind through the gearbox. The R-4 began to descend, slowly. 50 feet per minute, 100. Peterson pushed the cyclic stick forward, dove toward the saddle, trading altitude for airspeed. The helicopter accelerated. The rotor RPM increased. 205, 210, 220. as faster airflow through the blades spun them faster. They crossed the saddle with 20 feet of vertical clearance. On the far side, Peterson hauled back on the cyclic, flared the helicopter, trading airspeed for rotor RPM, converting kinetic energy into rotational energy. The nose pitched up. The airspeed dropped to 0. The rotor spun at 240 RPM, faster than it had ever spun under power. Then gravity took over. The R-4 descended, no engine, no power, just a windmilling rotor and 6,000 feet of altitude. Peterson aimed for a clear patch on the mountainside, a rocky outcrop free of trees. At 50 feet, he pulled collective pitch. The rotor blades bit air, converting their rotational energy into lift. The descent slowed. 20 feet, 10 feet, the skids hit rock. Hard. The R-4 bounced, tilted, settled. The rotor continued spinning for 5 seconds, then stopped. Silent. Peterson and Murphy sat in the cockpit, breathing. Not moving, just breathing. "We're alive," Murphy said finally. "Yeah." "The transmission's destroyed." "Yeah." "We're on the wrong side of a mountain with no fuel." "Yeah." Murphy started laughing. Peterson joined him, exhausted, adrenaline crashed, half-hysterical laughter. They climbed out. The R-4 sat on the mountainside, smoking, broken, beautiful. Peterson put his hand on the fuselage. "You got us here," he said to the helicopter. "Good girl." 6 hours later, a ground team reached them. An L-5 liaison plane, operating from a closer forward strip, dropped fuel and a mechanic. It took 2 days to replace the transmission. The 4 B-25 crewmen were extracted by ground patrol, alive, unharmed. When Peterson flew the repaired R-4 back to Lalaghat, the crew chief met him on the taxiway. "You brought her back," Hawkins said. "Told you I would. You wrote off the transmission. Wrote off 4 transmissions, if that's what it took." Hawkins nodded, didn't argue. That night, Peterson retrieved the envelope from the ready tent table, tore it open, pulled out the letter he'd written to his wife, read it once, then burned it in a fuel drum. Murphy did the same. No mail call, after all. The mission, officially designated Operation Persistent Retrieval, went into the 1st Air Commando Group's classified records. Peterson received the Distinguished Flying Cross. Murphy received the Air Medal. The B-25 crew returned to duty. The R-4 that flew the mission, serial number 43-46506, logged another 80 hours before the war ended. It returned to the United States in late 1945, was decommissioned, and eventually ended up in storage. But the mission proved something that changed military aviation forever. Helicopters weren't novelties. They were lifesavers. By 1950, the U.S. military ordered thousands of helicopters. Sikorsky's designs evolved into the H-19, the H-34, the legendary UH-1 Huey. Every medevac mission in Korea, every jungle rescue in Vietnam, every mountain extraction in Afghanistan, all descended from those early R-4 flights over Burma. Peterson continued flying helicopters after the war. He tested the H-5, the H-19, helped develop cold-weather helicopter operations in Alaska. He retired a colonel in 1963, died in 1998, age 79. In his oral history recorded in 1987, Peterson was asked about the Ridge mission, the one where he'd written his will first. "Did you think you were going to die?" the interviewer asked. Peterson was silent for a long moment. "I thought the helicopter might die," he said finally. "That machine gave everything it had, flew beyond its limits, kept turning when it should have quit. That's the thing people don't understand about early helicopters. They weren't reliable, they weren't safe, but they were willing. You asked them to do the impossible, and they tried." He paused, and sometimes, he said, they made it. Today, helicopters are everywhere. Search and rescue, medical evacuation, firefighting, disaster relief, combat assault. We take them for granted. Machines that can land anywhere, hover motionless, pluck people from places no airplane can reach. But in 1945, helicopters weren't inevitable. They were experimental, fragile, unproven. They became essential because of men like Peterson and Murphy. Pilots who flew machines that shouldn't have worked. Mechanics who kept them flying with wire and hope. Crews who wrote their wills before missions because the odds said they wouldn't come back. Most of them did come back, some didn't. All of them proved that rotary wing flight wasn't just possible, it was necessary. The R-4 that crossed the Naga Hills that day, that climbed higher than it was supposed to, hovered longer than it should have, flew home on a dying transmission and vapor fuel, sits now in a museum in Connecticut, restored, polished, rotor blades frozen mid-rotation. There's a plaque beside it. It lists the specifications, the missions flown, the lives saved. It doesn't mention the letters written in a ready tent. The envelope sealed and left behind, the transmission that screamed for 6 minutes straight and somehow didn't seize. But if you stand close enough, if you look at the gearbox housing, you can still see the scorch marks, evidence of a machine that gave everything and got 4 men home. The helicopter is probably the most versatile instrument ever invented by man. It approaches closer than any other vehicle to fulfillment of mankind's ancient dreams of the flying horse and the magic carpet. Igor Sikorsky, 1958.